Welcome to Meizon Mission. My name is Kevin. Thanks so much for joining us today. Meizon is the Greek word for greater. The Meizon Mission is about creating greater spaces for people to hear and experience the good news of Jesus. You can find out more about us by visiting our website, meizonmission.com. If you'd like to, you can fill out our Digital Connect card. Just scan the QR code that's on your screen. You can sign up for a house church there. You can, if you have any prayer requests, you can let us know there, or you can sign up for other opportunities that we have available to you. So let's just spend some time singing some songs with the band.
And oh, your love is a fortress. And you I'm fearless, and you I'm fearless. And oh, what could stand up against us? And you I'm fearless, and you I'm fearless. And I won't fear what tomorrow will bear. Let it come, let it come. And in your hands you hold all my cares. Everyone, everyone. You can hold this ground before me in the face of 1,000 armies. You hold this ground before me, oh God. And oh, your love is a fortress. And you I'm fearless. And you I'm fearless. And oh, what could stand up against us? And you I'm fearless. And you I'm fearless. And I won't fear what tomorrow will bear. Let it come, let it come. And in your hands you hold all my cares. Everyone, everyone. You can hold this ground before me in the face of 1,000 armies. You hold this ground before me, oh God. You can hold this ground. You can hold this ground before me in the face of 1,000 armies. You hold this ground before me, oh God. And oh, your love is a fortress. And you I'm fearless. And you I'm fearless. And oh, what could stand up against us? And you I'm fearless. And you I'm fearless. The perfect love, it casts out all fear. Your perfect love, it casts out all fear. 'Cause in you, Jesus, in you, Jesus, I am victorious. Yes, I am fearless. Oh, I am victorious. And I am fearless. And oh,
Well, one of the greater spaces that we want to make in our community at Meizon is inclusive spaces for LGBTQ plus people. Last week we talked about going back to the temple and this whole idea of fighting for a place at the table for those who've been rejected or discarded by the church. Well, today I'm really excited because I have my friend Drake Cromer-Moore. He's the pastor at First Christian Church of Gainesville, and he's here with me for a conversation about that very thing. And so, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Could you just tell us a little bit about how you learned about Meizon and just kind of give people a background on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess basically it was through the grapevine. It was, hey, these guys, Levi and Kevin, are doing some really cool things at Meizon. And then I added Levi on Facebook and got coffee with him. And then I added you on Facebook and got coffee with you. And next thing you know, you're meeting at FCC. So
I know, it's awesome. And that is actually one of the things, if you didn't know, if you're one of our viewers who hasn't attended Meizon Live, we actually, starting on Easter, we've been meeting at First Christian Church here in Gainesville in the Fellowship Hall, and that has been awesome. It's been a perfect space for us, so really excited about that. Well, I just wanted to ask you a little bit, if you'd feel comfortable sharing a little bit of your story with us, just kind of how did you become a pastor? How does that work with you being a outwardly homosexual pastor? I mean, do you mind sharing a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, it's convoluted. We've talked about this before. I think one of the things that's really interesting about learning to tell my story is that I'm learning to tell my story. Yeah. We're always taught to be able to tell our testimony. That's kind of, if you grew up in the church, you know how to give your testimony. When did you accept Jesus Christ as your forever friend? When were you baptized? When did you stray away but then come back while you were in college Bible study? All of these things that you learn how to do. And I've always done that without the gay part. Now the problem is you really can't separate being gay from me. That's just there, right? So I'm still learning how to tell that story. I grew up in a non-Christian household. My mom, she started reading the Bible sometime around 2004. She was given a NLT study Bible, that thick, pleather, all the good stuff. Yeah. We started attending a church up in Ohio that was at the time about 3,500 people, one campus. By the time I left was 10,000 people and 5 campuses. So it's safe to say it was a mega church. And so I kind of grew up in your stereotypical youth group, kind of grew up with your stereotypical youth pastor, kind of had the generic evangelical church experience. We sang Hillsong in Jesus Culture, and every once in a while they did a secular song from the stage too. So I know it was super dicey, very progressive. And so, we kind of, the interesting thing about my family is my mom and dad, I remember when they got baptized, it was about the same time frame that I, for lack of a better way to say it, accepted Jesus Christ as my forever friend. Yeah. And because that's what we would have learned at kids' church. And so my family kind of grew in faith together. But as you grow in faith together, you also kind of take your own little deviations. And so I remember very specifically one time when I was 16 that, the laptop had died while I was talking to a friend on Skype Instant Messenger. And my mom plugged the computer in while I was at the gym, and it could have been AOL Instant Messenger. See, it's a Skype Instant Messenger. And it pulls up all the chat logs, and she calls me and says, Drake, at the time I had said I was bi to this friend. She goes, Drake, you're bi. And she was very audibly upset. Yeah. And so I remember my dad picked me up from the gym, and he's basically, is this true? Is this true? And I'm kind of making up all of these things, why it wasn't true. And I remember getting home, and my mom was calling all of my friends that she suspected to be gay and telling them never to talk to me again. And she was trying to save me from being gay. Right. I remember going upstairs and reading Stepping Up, which was a book about biblical manhood. And that was the thing, I had separated being gay from being a biblical man. Right. And I remember very specifically the next day that her conversation with me was well, Drake, I understand the people you were talking to were not bad looking, but also just focus on girls because that's what God would want. I kept lying to myself, but also lying to my parents, where I could get rid of this. And eventually was in the senior leadership development program at my church and started finding God in theology, which was really cool. Went to Passion, and at Passion, I had accepted my call to ministry. People had always said, well, Drake, you'd be really good at being pastor, you'd be really good youth pastor, you'd be really good at this, and I never wanted to because of the accountability. Right. But the accountability wasn't just because of the accountability or the leadership or the responsibility. It was because, well, Drake, you can't be a gay pastor. I went to a Christian university, Cedarville University, and I think one of the things that I want to stress about Cedarville is I don't hate the institution. I have a lot of really great memories there. I won't ever forget like getting to worship with people every day, 4,000 students, and getting to sing Christian worship music. Like I won't forget those experiences. They were awesome. The only time that ever really started to break down was when I started to question what I believed. Like, was it really true that I had to be straight in order to be a Christian, in order to be a pastor? Yeah. And, eventually some things came up that I started saying, well, I guess I'm not, I need to own the fact that I'm not straight. And I started looking into it, and pretty much everything I was finding was defeating, like, you can be gay and Christian, because that's largely what had ruled the web at the time. Started coming out to people as being same-sex attracted. There was a few trusted friends that I told I'm same-sex attracted, non-affirming, celibate for the rest of my life. And if God is going to bring a woman into my life, then I won't shut that down. Until I met this guy who was the childhood friend of a really good friend of mine. And he had also gone to another very conservative evangelical institution. And so I assumed he was also non-affirming. And we became really good friends. And he helped to show me that God loved me how I was. Yeah. And I remember reading Psalm 139 in the back of in the front seat of my car in the back parking lot, and skipping my Greek class because I couldn't control my tears. Yeah. Because I'm in this space where I had always rejected this, but now I'm seeing that the light and the dark are the same to God. Like, even when I was in the closet, God loved me. God had created me that way. I went to my mentor, Chad, and I told this whole story to Chad, and I ended the story with, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, Chad, I don't like girls. And he's like, well, so what you're telling me is you're gay. And I'm like, well, yes, Chad, thank you. And he's like, so what do you want from me? And I'm like, well, that was crass. I'm like, what do you want from me? And he goes, I said, I want to go through these passages in the Bible that supposedly talk about gay people and help me navigate those. And he goes, Drake, and he goes, I'll do anything for you. He goes, but I hate to burst your bubble. The Bible's not about you. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, the Bible is about Jesus. From beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible is about Jesus. And that kind of started my journey of figuring things out. And so I went to Japan on a missions trip and started reading all of these different authors. And I remember one night specifically, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning in Japan. It was daytime here. And I called Chad and I'm like, Chad, there's nothing left. He's like, well, what do you mean? Expand on that. I'm like, there's nothing left but Jesus. And he goes, well, good, man. He starts like chuckling. He goes, that's exactly where you're supposed to be. When I got back to Pittsburgh, which is where I had moved, I went to my first ever affirming church service. I was reading a book that had included Thomas Merton's well-known prayer. And it basically talks about, Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing, but I have the desire to please you, and I believe that desire to please you does in fact please you. Now that is a terribly butchered version of that prayer. But the very next day I went to my first ever affirming church service with a woman pastor. Gasp. And that was in the bulletin. That was the read and response that day. And I was like, okay, all right, fine. And I'm like, this is probably where I'm supposed to be. And then I ended up finding the Disciples Church, which is, we're part of the Disciples at First Christian Church. It's a denomination. And I remember taking communion for the first time as an openly gay person and just crying on the car ride home. And I think when you ask, how does it work being a gay pastor, it's trying to save people from the experience that I had growing up, and educate people so they don't let the people around them have that same experience, but moreover, helping people to experience what I experienced at that table.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
That's really good. I want to like kind of press into something and unpack something a little bit. So for you, when you were processing through all of that, was there a moment where you were like, because like the popular kind of like non-denominational evangelical church experiences, you're welcome here. Everybody, like there's you belong here. Like that's the everybody's kind of trying to make this like attractive, safe space. These almost like trigger words at the forefront of what they're doing to try to get people who may be homosexual to come and try their church because it's safe. What was it that kind of kept you from wanting to try again? Or like what was it that made you feel like, oh, I can't go back to those spaces?
Well,
I'm just curious.
There's several things. I mean, what people don't understand is that every church, like most people hear Southern Baptist and they go, ooh, right?
Yeah.
Like
most non-denominationals are Southern Baptist.
They're Southern Baptist light, right? And or Southern Baptist.
Right.
Southern Baptist with a cool website.
Right.
And so the Southern Baptist church I was a part of was a very nice community.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we were about, when I started there, we were probably 250 people. Like we were, I say small because I grew up in a church of 10,000 people. But they were a loving community, right? I never doubted those people's love for me while I served them.
Yeah.
But when I started becoming affirming of myself, walking through those pews was really difficult for me because I knew that they loved me without knowing this other thing.
Right.
And so all of that was proven to me later. There was one person that I had a really good relationship with that I thought maybe we could have a discussion. We were really good friends. I was friends with him and his wife, and their kid called me Uncle Drake. And he calls me to tell me that we can't be friends unless I'm willing to renounce my sin because the Bible says that we can't be unequally yoked. And so in that moment, this is one person who knew me and loved me more than anybody in that church, right? Who knew me and loved me. And I haven't talked to him since that conversation. And so for me, going back and trying those spaces again, I don't have any desire.
Right.
And it's now, don't get me wrong, I put myself in those places sometimes, right? Like I went to a Chris Tomlin concert. Like I think that's putting myself in that space sometimes. Right. But the lack of clarity hurts people.
Yeah.
And so my biggest fear from my friends who attend churches that create this safe space is how those roles and areas and limitations are not clearly defined. And so I've watched people climb the ladder and start serving and saying, well, now I want to take the dip. I want to serve in youth ministry. Oh, sorry, you can't be around our kids because you're gay. Right? I want to get baptized. I want my kid to be dedicated. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't because you're gay. Right? And so it's not saying that's every church. But the problem is a church should never create an environment, even if it is a safe space, where someone doesn't know if they can talk about their life outside of church. And that's my biggest qualm. I mean, I even remember, like, the church I grew up in was very much that safe space. Yeah. And I remember, even as somebody who was gay, telling a student that Jesus had a better life for him. And I remember saying, Mom, I wonder if I should tell him that I struggle with this. She said, no, it'll get out. And so me thinking about this and saying, well, my church does not take an open stance on this issue for a reason, right? Because they just would rather have people who are okay with it and people who are not sit in the same chairs. It doesn't make a safe space for queer people. It only makes a safe space for not talking about things. And so I guess for me, I don't ever, like, I'm a pastor, so I hold a position of leadership. Even within my own church, we are now an openly affirming congregation. But even with my own church, when I joined, we were an affirming congregation. When I became pastor, there were people who left. Right. And so I just don't desire to be part of a congregation that doesn't know me for me and doesn't love me for me. And I think that for me, there's a difference between welcoming and celebratory of people.
Well, I think one of the kingdom values, like when you look at the gospel, especially like the book of Acts, and you look at the things that Jesus said, like like Jesus was, it was all about being known, right?
Yeah.
Like being fully known. Like God wants to be fully known to us.
Absolutely.
And in order for him to be fully known to us, we need to be fully known to him and to each other.
Yeah.
That's where the real beauty of the church is discovered and found.
Yeah.
And when you enter into a space where you know you can't be fully known.
Yeah.
Because if I'm fully known, then people will be either offended or hurt or will leave. Because of this, it disrupts the order of what the church really could or should be.
Well, it creates a church founded on correct belief or correct opinion or correct lifestyle over a church that's centered on love. And I think exactly what you're talking about is true. I mean, I think part of what you see in all of that is like when Jesus meets the woman caught in adultery, or when Jesus meets the woman at the well, he's telling them that they're known. And I think if we desire to model Christ, then we should want to know other people and have other people know us. You know,
last week we talked about that verse in the book of Acts and about how they hung out and worshiped in the temple courts. Mm-hmm. And I talked about how, it's really interesting that they would go back to that place because it wasn't a safe place. Like the people who schemed to basically kill Jesus were still the leaders there, and the Christians were there talking to people about Jesus. So it's like this was definitely a movement that was starting to take shape that was threatening the order of things.
Absolutely.
And so they go back to this place and I kind of posed the question, like, why not just leave? Like, why not just go leave and start something new? Like, move to a new town.
Yeah.
Start a new temple. Like, isn't that safer? Isn't it better just let's just burn down the past and build a new future? But I think one of the things that I'm realizing as I pray and as I seek the Lord on it and as I read the scriptures and I do my study, I think one of the things I'm realizing is that Jesus was part of a bigger story.
Yeah.
And that story isn't always pretty. There's a lot of bumps in that road in the story. But isn't that the same with us? Like, our stories aren't always like your story isn't all pretty. Like, for you to come to a place where you were able to accept you for who you really were and to accept that God had seen you for who you really were, like, is beautiful. That time you took communion for the first time, that's like a beautiful experience.
Yeah.
But it took, like, the road to get there was hell, right?
Yeah,
It was hell to get
terrible.
there.
It was horrible. Yeah.
But God wants to redeem the whole story. Like, so I think it's so cool to hear you like, oh, I took my husband to see Chris Tomlin. Like, it's like, because in doing that, what are you doing? You're going back and you're resurrecting, you're restoring the story. Like, you're taking these places back. You're reclaiming these spaces that were bad.
Yeah.
They were negative. They had negative things, but there was value there. There was still stuff there that was worth kind of taking back, And so I talk about this idea. You and I talked about this a lot. Like the whole like fighting for your place at the evangelical table. I have that. The church is a beautiful thing, despite its cracks, despite all of the things that are wrong. And trust me, there are a lot of things wrong.
Yeah.
I still think that there's value worth restoring. I still think that the church is the vehicle that God wants to use to bring the kingdom to earth as it is in heaven.
And if the vehicle's moving, why would you jump out?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but I know that that's hard for people who have been hurt. I know that's hard for people who have gone through experiences much like yours. Now that you're here, as a gay pastor leading a fully affirming congregation, do you ever feel that tension between just wanting to like run and start something new versus wanting to stay and do something that's like more mainstream Christian evangelical? Like I'm just curious, like if you can like speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because other people feel the need to speak into my life more often than I do. Whether it be on, social media or in person. And I did have somebody tell me one time, it was right after I had first moved to Gainesville. Why are you a pastor? Look at the oppressed supporting the oppression. And I was like, oh my, that's like one of the comments that's really stuck with me. Yeah. And I think for me, the hope for kind of this church vehicle that we're in, because I mean, there's a lot of different church vehicles. I mean, there's the big one, right? There's like the car hauler. Yes. And then there's a bunch of other vehicles, right? Like a lot of my friends who are gay or queer are within the Episcopal Church. right? Like they've been open and affirming for a lot longer than a majority of the evangelical church.
Yeah, yeah.
But I was like, well, I don't want to like sit down and stand up a bunch of times, you know, like it wasn't for me. And in fact, that's where Rachel Held Evans had landed, and Pete Enns, you know, some of my favorite theologians and scholars ended up in the Episcopal Church. But I'm like, well, why do I keep wanting to do things with this evangelical church? And I think for me, there's several reasons. I think one of them is, so one of our denominational kind of big things is actually we're the biggest thing is to be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world.
I love that.
And I love it, right? I think that's ultimately what the table is, right? What communion is a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. And so when we talk about being a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world, like I just can't deny the way that God is moving in the church right now.
Yeah.
Like I don't think I can stress enough that like as far as like evangelical churches go, like First Christian Church was the only one that I knew of, the only one that was publicly affirming online, right, as of not that long ago.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And so then there's all of these young people who are coming back to church. And just in Gainesville alone, right, because we have to talk even within our own context. Just within Gainesville alone, I look at all of the pastors that I've either been able to network with or on affirming journeys of their own, or I've taken their churches there, and I go, well, it's been like, since we were the only gay church, or the only church on gaychurch.org, which means that you're an affirming congregation, up until you guys came on, up until Shift came on, like up until I met and got to know you guys. And so when I go, and you guys, like Shift has not been affirming since before February, and you guys are a brand new church. Yeah. And so I just look at the way that God is moving in the church. And I even, like I was telling somebody the other day, if I were to search like gay Christian or gay in the Bible, even just 5 or 6 years ago, the resources that would have come up first would have been like thoroughly damning evidence as to why you couldn't be queer and Christian. Right. Whereas now, if you search that, the first ones that come up are open and affirming churches, open and affirming resources. And so I just look at all the ways that God is moving in this church, and I want to be a part of that. And so like one of the ways that I've even seen like within my own congregation, and I won't use names, but I have one individual who has been really, really hurt by the church. And he basically, you know, had told me, like, Drake, I don't identify as a Christian, but I really want to be. Yeah. And he's here because of that. And then he's been coming since, you know, fall of last year. And at Easter, he was raising his hand during worship. That's awesome. And so I look at that and I'm like, okay, here's this guy that I have really honest conversations with. We talk about all these crazy, deep theological, philosophical ideas, and I've watched him consistently deny God, but really want to believe in him. Yeah. And so when I'm looking at this movement, within evangelicalism, it's funny because it seems like there's a counter movement and they're showing their face, you know, on some things, but I don't want to abandon something that so many people hold so dear. And I think even for me, like we were talking about the difference between doing hymns and contemporary music. Like the language of worship has changed, right? Like pretty much everybody under the age of 30 or 35 has now grown up in a church that grew up singing Indescribable and Our God and like all of these early Hillsong and Chris Tomlin songs. Right. And
worship used to be the underground.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And now worship is the mainstream.
Exactly. And so now, but the thing is they grew up in that and they want that now. And so for me, I'm looking at it like, okay, well, if I'm not the only person who said, maybe I can't go to this church because this is not how I'd feel so comfortable, then there's got to be other people. Yeah. And I've seen that. In our own church, you know? And so for me, I want people to know that they are loved in the language that they know and love. And so I think evangelicalism provides that structure for a lot of people. Yeah,
that's really good. So I know we're going to press into the uncomfortable part of the conversation, you know. So like me as a straight, white, cis male, like, you know, I know that I have unconsciously harmed gay and queer people, and I need to repent of those things. And I know I'm not alone in that. And I know that there's people both inside and outside the church who feel that way. I don't really feel like it's the oppressed people group's responsibility to educate the oppressors of how to love queer folks, but I do think that many people in our community are just overwhelmed and we don't really know where to start. We want to be part of the solution, and we don't want to be complicit in allowing these things to continue.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to like kind of speak to that? Like I know, like I said, it's uncomfortable to ask, but I also am kind of like, you know our hearts, and you know where we're at as a community and what we're trying to do, and so I was hoping that you might speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, so first off, I want to stay in my lane. So I want to speak to the things that I can speak to and not to the things that I can't. I think that that's important. I can speak to like a broad queer community, but I can't get like super specific on things that are outside of my criteria. I think effort is always good. Yeah. And I think that's so one of the things that I think people do accidentally is they put relationship or just not knowing as a really good excuse field to not make any effort to move forward. And so like, well, I've seen that within people that I know, basically, where they'll say, well, I don't know any X group of people, and so therefore once I get to know those people, it'll be easier, which is true. But it also doesn't, say, for example, allow you to misgender someone. Right? And it's okay to mess up. Like, that's the thing. Nobody's really going to get mad if you mess up. Right. But I think one of the things to understand within a church environment is there is a lot of hurt, and so you don't really want to give somebody an excuse. And you don't want to give somebody an excuse to be more hurt or to say, well, this church isn't any different from the churches I've been a part of. Yeah. And so for me, I just think effort is helpful. I think the biggest thing for me is just showing that you care. Yeah. And showing that you care is just showing that you're putting in effort. I've even had people, like I had an 84-year-old guy, I always said, he goes, well, you keep talking about your husband. How do you decide which one of you's the husband? Right. And it didn't make me upset. Right? I mean, I just kind of laughed and said, well, we're both husbands. Right? And I think that's one of the things that, unfortunately, our culture has taught us is that differing communities are toxic toward one another, and they can be. But I don't think that that's the broad scope of people. If somebody asks, my husband and I, which one's the boy and which one's the girl, because I've been asked that, right. I would say, well, I mean, that's not really how that works. We're both guys, right? I mean, I'm not going to get upset or offended, but I think that question itself is kind of offensive, but asking the question shows the effort.
Right.
And I think...
Do you think that relational equity plays into that too? Like there's questions that I feel much more comfortable asking you now that I've known you for a while. Yeah. That I wouldn't have asked you probably the first week we started talking. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, so relational equity
is
huge. Is also a part. Like, you and I had the conversation about how like the people who kind of usually come around on the issue of supporting or being affirming, it's always a relational element. Like it's a person like that, either a family member or a dear friend or someone who we're in close relational radius of. Yeah. So relational equity, do you think that's like really crucial?
Yeah, I think so. But I think what's so kind of interesting about relational equity is, okay, so for example, you could say, well, I have a son or a brother or a cousin or a sibling who's gay or who's gender queer or gender non-binary or anything under the sun within the queer community, right? And that would be kind of an instant amount of relational equity. I think where we get kind of dicey within the church world is you don't initially have relational equity with new people. Right? So if you're encountering people for the first time as far as somebody who's different from you or something different than you've experienced, I think that relational equity is going to come into play. You just have to build it. Which is why I think that effort is so important. Showing the effort, I think, is going to help you build that relational equity. That's really good. Especially now. I think now is an unprecedented time, where we're seeing things that we've all never experienced before.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So just pivoting on that, now that we've talked about kind of the spaces that exist for, there's not a lot of spaces that exist for queer Christians or queer questioning people of faith. that are trying to find places to ask those questions. I think one of the things that we've just connected on is that need. Like, there's a need in this city for more spaces that are affirming, that are fully inclusive to LGBTQIA plus. Like, do you think that there's like kind of an undertow building here in our community for gay Christians to find a space where they're welcome?
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll start broadly and then I'll zoom in.
Yeah.
I think broadly, absolutely. I think locally, absolutely, but broadly in a different way. I think broadly, now in America, we're seeing a lot of backlash against queer people, and it's hard to have to see this on the news and to not really be accepted by your family, and you need people need to be in community.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that we were always kind of taught in college was, well, the good news is when you finally do get a job and you get to move to that new town, you can just find yourself a good Bible-believing church and you'll have your friends, right? But the thing is it's true.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe not all of it, but like moving or finding a community is huge for people's mental, emotional, and spiritual health. And so I think what's happening on massive proportions in this country are these affirming spaces. I say massive proportions, I just mean greater than a few years ago. Yeah. But we're watching all of these churches move into these spaces, and we're watching kids, I think even, I'm going to speak on a not queer level for a second. I think we've always heard, this is coming to a local level, but we've always heard that young people are leaving the church because, they didn't have enough biblical training when they went to college. And
they're not being discipled.
Yes. And yes, they're not being discipled, and they met that they're going to meet atheist biology professors.
Right. They're going to go to college,
and
the liberal machine is going to swallow them whole.
Yes.
Right.
The thing is that's what we learned, right?
Right.
And I even remember teaching that, when I was teaching in youth group, when I was in near Dayton. And so, then you come into an affirming church space, or you come into a town like Gainesville. These kids who are leaving the faith and not coming back are leaving because they heard about this Jesus. They loved this Jesus who was all loving and just wanted to be your forever friend. But they didn't know any openly gay people. They didn't know any openly queer people. They didn't know a kid from a different society with a different religious background. I was taught that Jesus hates this person, and they're now my friend, and I eat lunch with them every day, right? And so people are leaving the church because they're not given a space to ask questions, right? They're leaving the church because they love their gay friends. They love their Islamic friends. They love people from different cultures and backgrounds, and they always thought that Jesus was supposed to, but they were taught that Jesus wasn't going to. Right. And so creating
it's inconsistencies, right?
Yeah.
It's the Jesus says this, but you're doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And even my mom says Jesus love the sinner, hate the sin. Jesus hates sin, so Jesus hates you being gay. Doesn't hate you. She thinks they're separate. You can separate those things. And so I think creating those greater spaces, it means creating a community where people can ask questions and talk and riff on things together. Yeah. I would love more spaces within Gainesville, and that's a space that we try and create at FCC, and I know that's a space that you try to create at Meizon, and I know that's a space that Joe's trying to create at Shift, where people can ask questions and people can just be together, be in community, and people are bought into the mission of loving like Jesus. Yeah. And again, I think buying into the mission of loving like Jesus, I think that is what the church is all about. And so if you can create a community that's knit together by love, of course they're going to buy into love.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
When I look at how can we impact the most number of people in Gainesville, I think that looks like these churches like Shift and Meizon and FCC, coming together to work together to create these greater spaces together.
Yeah.
Right? Because ultimately, we're all for building into this community and building into, and I say this community, I mean Gainesville, and building into a community within our community of Gainesville that is a force for good, a force for love, a force for peace and kindness and hope and all the fruits of the Spirit. And that's, for me, when I look at the future of the church, the Big C church, it looks like churches like ours coming together to make a difference where we are in our community.
I know that God is doing things and he wants to change people's lives still.
Yeah.
And I think that we want to see that still. But I think what it means for us is that maybe that means that we have to fight for a seat at the table for the people who are the least of these, the people who are hurting, the people who are marginalized, the people who are being discarded and pushed out, the people who are being told that they don't have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
I think we have a responsibility to be like, no. Like, that's their seat.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to take that seat away from them. Like, it's like, that's how I feel about you, is like, I feel like you have a voice in this community that people need to hear. Yeah. And I want to fight for you to have that voice.
Thank you.
And I think it's really important. And so I hope that we can keep doing this. I know we got to wrap up.
Yeah.
I think this conversation was really valuable. I'm really appreciative of you coming and sharing.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it.
And I hope we can do this more.
Oh, absolutely. 100%.
But like, I just want to put the challenge out to Meizon and anybody who's watching this. There is something that God is doing in this. I believe that God is creating greater spaces for us, and it's uncomfortable, but I think we can kind of make these spaces. We can fight for these seats at the table for marginalized people in our community, and I think in the end, we're going to be better off for it. God's going to do amazing things through it. All right. Well, we're gonna close our time together with another song. And so once again, I'm just so thankful for this conversation. And thanks so much for listening.
I'm caught up in your presence. I just wanna sit here at your feet. I'm caught up in this holy moment. I never wanna leave. Though I'm not here for blessings, Jesus, you don't owe me anything, and more than anything that you can do, I just want you. And I'm sorry when I've just gone through the motions. And I'm sorry when I just sang another song. Well, take me back to where we started. I open up my heart to you. And I'm sorry when I've come with my agenda. And I'm sorry when I forgot that you're enough. Well, take me back to where we started. I open up my heart to you. I'm caught up in your presence. I just wanna sit here at your feet. I'm caught up in this holy moment. for blessings. Jesus, you don't owe me anything, and more than anything that you can do, I just want you. I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. And I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. And I just want you, and nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. I'm caught up in your presence, and I just wanna sit here at your feet. I'm caught up in this holy moment. I never wanna leave. Oh, I'm not here for blessings, no. Jesus, you don't owe me anything, more than anything that you can do. I just want you.
If you would just join me for a quick prayer. God, we thank you for Drake. We thank you for FCC and Shift Church and for Meizon, these communities that you are raising up in our city to be safe places, inclusive places, affirming spaces for LGBTQ plus people. God, I pray that your spirit would move in these spaces, that you would make yourself known in these spaces. Lord, that your grace would abound in these spaces, that people would know you, know your love, and know that you are for them, that you are with them, and that they can be known just as you want to be known in these spaces. God, we thank you, and we just ask for you to continue to grow what you're doing here through these spaces. And Lord, we love you in your name. Amen. Hey, just a few announcements before you go. We've got house church next Sunday, but there is no Meizon program on the Sunday after that on May 29th. And then we are back for Meizon Live at First Christian Church of Gainesville on June 5th. So that's what the next few weeks looks like. Also, we want to let you know that all of this, these programs, these teachings, our Meizon Lives and our house church programs, none of this is possible without the financial support from people just like you. And so if you like what you're seeing here, if the stuff that we're doing is changing your life or encouraging you, and inspiring you and giving you hope, I just want to encourage you to help support the Meizon Mission with a one-time donation, or you can set up recurring giving. You can text to give at the number on your screen. You can also scan the QR code. You could go to our website, meizonmission.com, and follow the buttons to give. You can also send us a check to the address that's going to be shown on the screen at the end of this service. There's no way that we could do this without your help, and so we just want to thank you so much for supporting the Meizon Mission. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll see you next week at House Church.